I got the engine pretty well dressed and ready to go back in the car. I'm adding a couple of quarts of oil. I'm going to do a quick prelude, make sure that the oil pump primes and the filter fills and we get oil coming up before I commit to dropping it back in the car. At this point I could always, I wouldn't want to, but I can always drain it, flip it upside down, take the pan off and repair what's wrong a lot easier than getting it out of the car. So for the sake of doing this, I'll just start with a couple quarts of oil, and that ought to be enough to pick up. If it isn't, I'll add some more. And ultimately I'll have to do that, but no sense wasting. So that's 2 quarts. And let's see where we're at. Here's my handy dandy prelude tool. Everything should be plugged up, and I've got something in this oil galley. All the other plugs are in, so this is kind of the proof of the pudding. All right. Really loads down when you do this. I start to see it coming up the push rods now. Loads down as the pressure comes up and the filter gets full. And give my drill a rest, it's going to overheat. Don't want to burn it up. Well, I think I proved what I needed to prove, which was that I was getting oil starting to come up to the tops of the push rods. The filter must be full. I got pressure. So at this stage, we'll set this aside. It's a pretty hefty 1/2-inch hammer drill, but that oil pump will really load it down. Well, that's it for now. I'm going to clean up. I got a couple more things to put on, and then it'll be time to drop it back in the car. Well, I'm just about ready to go ahead and drop it back in the car. Just a couple of notes. I guess one is I spent a couple hours this morning replacing the torque converter seal. Just for good measure. It's 30 years old, probably, and so I removed the converter, and it's a struggle getting them out. It took me quite a while to pry the old seal out, drive the new one in. I used a little homemade tool here so that you can drive it in squarely. It's a bushing and a piece of pipe glued together. Actually, that part worked pretty well. Getting it out was pretty difficult, but I finally did. Right now I've got the transmission with a jack under it, and it's jacked up about as high in the tunnel as it'll go. I got the cable's all back out of the way. The pipe for the catalytic converter air tube is out of the way. So I'm pretty good shape, about ready to bring the hoist over and get it off the engine stand and hang it. I'm not going to tape actually dropping the engine in. It's just an hour or two of fussing around, and I don't know if there's anything unique about that. So I'll be back again when after I get it in and start getting things dressed up. Well, I'm back. The engine is now in the car. As I said in the last clip, I didn't want to record a couple of hours of fiddling around, and actually it was about 2 hours to get everything together. I'm going to show you a couple of things here that I went through. I had my wife helping me on the hoist this time instead of trying to do it by myself. So she worked the cherry picker while I guided things into position. So a couple things. Let me get started here. So there's the engine in the bay, in where it's supposed to be. And I'll note that this little device, if you haven't seen this before, is a lifesaver. It's an engine leveler, so that you can turn the crank on the front and you can move this pivot point anywhere from the back to the front. So when you get the engine hanging on the hoist, you can tip it this way or you can tip it that way, and it really is an important thing when you're trying to get one of these engines in. If you've never worked on one of these Chevys before, I'm trying to get my light down here, but if you see the engine mount there in the middle is yeah, that's better. The black part in the center is the engine mount, the clamshell that's got the rubber mount in it. The gray part is the bracket that bolts to the engine block. And I wanted it to be a darker gray. I was trying to match the original, and ended up the paint was a little too light and I couldn't find suitable dark gray. So you can see the contrast anyway. If you look to the left a little bit between the lines here, again I'll try to get some light, there we go. You can see that the bolt sticking out there at the bottom, right there, which needs to have a nut on it. But the way these mounts work is you drop that bracket on top of the rubber mount. When the holes line up, you run that through bolt through and torque it down. And there's one of these on the right and the left, and incidentally the brackets on the right and the left are different part numbers. The engine doesn't actually sit exactly in the middle, so there's a little bit of an offset, so you have to watch which bracket's right and which bracket's left. But the challenge is, if you look at that bracket and you see where the rubber mount is, the challenge that you have is that you cannot pull the engine straight forward. Again, because you see the bracket's got a front and a back to it, and it goes over the top of the mount on both ends. So in order to get this engine out, you have to lift off that bracket. You've got to pick it up in the air about 2 or 3 inches before you can move forward. So the transmission's got dowel pins on it. You need to be able to lift things up, and you can't get it off the dowels until you get it high. So the challenge in this one is getting it up in the air, supporting the transmission, using that hoist to tip it a little bit, to twist it, raise the nose, and disengage the dowel pins and get it out. Going back in is doubly fun because, again, you have to try to get it in on an angle, raised up high enough. It's got to be high enough that those mounts clear until you get it in and established, and then you can lower that back until that back corner to the right in the picture, that bracket clears the black piece of mount that you can set it down, and that's a lot of work. What I used was I made some guide studs like this, and I put them in a couple of the bell housing bolt holes so that I had something to guide me as I went into the bell housing. The only problem was I put these in on the small block Chevy. I put them in on a, not on the bottom hole, but on an upper hole, which makes logical sense from lining things up. But I had a devil of time getting them out because you can't get a screwdriver inside the tunnel. I finally did with I mean, they were just finger tight. I was able to get them out with long nose pliers. But for a minute I thought I was going to have to pull the engine back out a second time. I used these the last time I had the engine out, but I must have put them in a different hole. In any case, also the reason, now that it's in the car, the reason I put it in without the valve covers, if you look down here to the back, see like right there, they put ground wires on each of the back corners of the cylinder head. So there's one here, and there's one over in that mess of wires on the back side, right about in there, right behind the head. And there's also an air pump tube that has to connect back there. And so my logic in leaving the valve covers off is, if you got a 4 or 5 inch valve cover over the top of that, it gets really hard to reach some of those things and to get into what I'll say is that rat's nest of wires back there and get them all sorted out. I've also got the, you'll see spark plug wires, and there's a plastic bag there that the distributor cap top portion is on there, the guide for the wires. So the whole set of wires is there in the bag, and they're routed. They're just very hard to route around the back of the block and down underneath the exhaust manifolds. So I've learned to route them, lay them in the valley. I'll pick them up out of there. What I'll be doing soon is doing valve covers. I'll finish the wires first, then I'll do valve covers, then I'll do the intake and get things hooked up in the back, and then we'll move to doing accessories in the front. And one last thing here. We talked about the converter seal. I did pull the converter seal. This is what the converter seal looks like. See if I can get a better view here. After I got it ripped out of there, I used several tools. It's got a flange on it, and ultimately I was able to hammer and pry on the flange. But you have to do this really gently. The reason it's so mangled is I have a tool for pulling seals, and that hooks underneath the lip unless you try to pull it out, but all it did was tear holes in it. It couldn't pull it out. So I got that out with, like I say, with a lot of hammering. I think I mentioned earlier I made this tool that picks up on the seal like so, and then you can drive it in with a hammer on the back end. The seal needs to go in. There's a shaft down the middle, so you need something that you can't just go in with a flat block of wood. And then on this transmission there's a clip that goes in over the top of that seal to help it keep it from backing out. I couldn't remember if the clip was present the last time I had the car apart, so I bought a spare, which is what that one is. And just one last comment on putting in the converter seal. You really should measure the lugs push the converter back before you take it off, and measure the distance from the bell housing to the converter bolt lugs. When you put the converter back on, you got to turn it, and it goes through 2 or 3 steps as it lines up and engages splines and engages the pump, and you want to make sure you're back at that same depth again when you're done. So that's current status. I'm about ready to start connecting wires and hooking things up. But that's all for now.